Thank you all for coming today to this gallery talk for MFA candidate Zoe Nielsen in support of her thesis exhibition, Tender Remains. My name is Brian Hitzelberger, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Art and Design Department here in the Rueff School of Visual and Performing Arts at Purdue. I'm also the co-chair of Zoe Nielsen's graduate committee, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing the artist today. The eyes of the animal, when they consider a man, are attentive and wary. The same animal may well look at other species in the same way. The animal does not reserve a special look for man, but by no other species except man will the animal's look be recognized as familiar. While other animals are held by that look, it is only man who becomes aware of himself in returning it. These are the words of the British critic John Berger from his 1977 essay, Why Look at Animals? It's a meditation on humanity's changing relationship to the animal world in the age of industrialization and mechanization. In distancing animals, he argues, we become more distant to ourselves. Zoe's work seeks to reclaim this distance from the animal, posing questions of what it is that we value in life, and by asking in what directions we might angle our care, particularly with regards to a life lived alongside chronic illness, and when it comes to the ethics of medical intervention. In Zoe's work, viewers are asked to reconsider exactly what constitutes life and survival, and both who and what are served by the human acts of memorial. Zoe Nicole Nielsen comes to Purdue from Wayne State College in Nebraska, where she received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in 2023. In addition to receiving both Promise and Delta Phi Delta grants from our department, her work has received awards and honors in exhibitions across the Midwest. During her time at Purdue, she's become a valued instructor in our department, teaching courses in drawing, painting, printmaking, and foundations. And next month, she will travel to the Pacific Northwest for a residency at the Alchemy Art Center in Friday Harbor, Washington. There, in addition to continuing her own projects, she will teach workshops in mold making, intaglio, and taxidermy. Her recent solo exhibition, Survival of the Not-So-Fittest, at the Arts Federation in Lafayette, Indiana, was so moving that during the opening, a small child couldn't help but pet the art. Should you feel the same impulse yourself, we politely ask that you restrain. Please join me in welcoming Zoe Nicole Nielsen.
Thank you, Brian, for the lovely introduction. Hello, and welcome to my thesis talk. This accompanies my exhibition, Tender Remains, which I've been working toward for the last 3 years here at Purdue. I'm really pleased to see you all here and excited to get into it, but I want to first thank my amazing committee members, Brian Hitzelberger, Charles Gick, Jen Shire, and Christine Winchell. Their guidance and insight has shaped the trajectory of this work, and their encouragement has helped me bring this thesis to life. I also want to thank those of you who have brought me a dead animal over the past few years, or helped me locate one on the side of the road, or have been my extra set of hands during taxidermy and mold making. In specific, I'd like to thank Emily Short, Morgan Durman, Jack McGann, and Rachel Brent, who made significant contributions to this body of work. You guys are awesome and very important to me. Now, the questions that sit quietly beneath all my work. How do we assign value to a life? And which bodies are protected and which are permitted to disappear? My practice begins with this instability and engages these questions in taxidermic sculpture, oil painting, and lithographic making. I often work with animal bodies in many stages of preservation, from decomposition to the final mold, making work inspired by moments from my interaction with each body. I want to acknowledge the works of Jonathan John and Robert Marbury and some notes toward a manifesto for artists working with and about taxidermy animals. Point number 9 reads, although we're making art, the material we use remains a dead animal. People have very strong reactions to seeing dead animals, no matter how they're presented. Acknowledge that this artwork will be upsetting to some people. Their words remain a guiding reminder of the emotional and ethical weight inherent in the work I present to you today. I hope to honor the lives of these animals and to hold space for the discomfort, compassion, and conversations that follow. That being said, proceed with the understanding that there will now be discussion of and several sensitive images of dead animals that some might consider graphic. Proceed with informed consent. There will be no further content warnings. I work almost exclusively with animals whose deaths went largely unwitnessed. Animals that died young or stillborn, roadkill, animals lost to illness, accident, nocturnal rejection, really any life that ended before they were fully realized. I encounter them as individuals whose deaths reveal the structures that determine whose lives are considered grievable, not just as specimens or materials or symbols. They are the weak, the discarded, the unfit by evolutionary standards, and those I feel bound to by a shared vulnerability. My proximity to death is not only philosophical. I live with type 1 diabetes, a chronic and incurable illness that requires continuous technological and medical intervention. Because of this, survival does not appear to me as something natural or guaranteed. My life is maintained through continuous intervention. Without insulin, I would die quickly within hours to days. And living this way has made mortality feel immediate rather than abstract. I live caught in this space between dying and keeping myself alive. It is often unpleasant, and it is a heavy responsibility that I carry into my work. Western traditions have long positioned the human outside of animality, constructing hierarchies that determine whose suffering matters. We tend to rank life, human, at the top and everything else beneath us. Yet biologically, emotionally, and socially, the distance between human and non-human animals is far less stable than we often pretend. When we insist on a strict separation between human and animal, we erase the reality that we are animals too. One of the most impactful books that I've ever read is titled The Undying by Anne Boyer. It is a memoir on her experience surviving breast cancer. Boyer writes, "In another life, I am a child who barely lives and mostly dies. I have often thought the same, but I'm not a child. I am an animal. In another life, I am a young animal who died quietly, somewhere unseen." Darwin's theory of natural selection and the survival of the fittest does not include people like me. My body does not meet nature's criteria for survival, and if I were to choose to reproduce, it could be considered a genetic disservice. It assumes that fitness is inherent, genetic, and measurable, that death weeds out the weak in the population, and that this is somehow necessary or even beneficial. That idea haunts me because I am not fit, I am something else, precarious and preserved. This troubling premise of the survival of the fittest of animals intersects with my own body and artistic practice. I ask, what does it mean to be an animal deemed unworthy of survival? And how might taxidermy become a space for reimagined work? This is the point where my work and my illness collapse into one another, and why I'm drawn to the animals that don't make it. I find kinship in their fragility. I clean them, skin them, tan them, paint their faces, and reconstruct their bodies. But to truly understand where my work fits within the broader field of taxidermy, it's important to trace the forms that the practice has historically taken and reflect how the shifting cultural narratives around animals' death and display. So time for a mini history lesson. Historically, taxidermy has served imperial, scientific, and trophy-driven desires to classify, to dominate, and to transform living beings into archetypes while erasing their singular identities. Taxidermic collections and natural history museums are built on violence. They are institutions of categorization, preservation, and characterization. Now, I'm not saying that the institutions are evil, because there is so much educational and social value that are held within these structures, but the fact remains that animals have long been killed not for food or survival, but for display and data and control. Museum taxidermy, in particular, has historically prioritized the species over the individual. It flattens animals into study skins or mounts them into idealized poses that strip away their singular histories. Animals were and sometimes still are killed to be studied. James Audubon was a French-American naturalist who lived from 1785 to 1851. He infamously killed thousands of birds to study for his illustrations, often shooting dozens or hundreds of birds in a single day for the sake of his collection of drawings called Birds of America, which is widely recognized to be of great ornithological importance and features 435 species, almost all of which he shot himself. Historically, hunting expeditions were paid to travel overseas and bring back as many new specimens as they could to be mounted and added to their collections. Although this sourcing practice has fallen out of favor today, the animals remain in institutional collections, perhaps on display, or perhaps collecting dust in basement storage, like these off-display animals photographed by Klaus Pichler in the Museum of Natural History in Vienna for his series entitled Skeletons in the Closet. Sport taxidermy shares this lineage. It is fundamentally about conquering and possession. A trophy mounted on the wall becomes a testament to human superiority and dominance. Primarily, sport taxidermists are male and reside in rural areas closer to where the animals that they mount will be killed. Most of these taxidermists mount deer hides on commercially produced foam forms. The only thing distinguishing one deer from the next is the size and score of the antlers it boasts. Ear tag holes and bullet holes are repaired, and most other flaws are covered, erasing the individuality of the animal and rendering it to a platonic ideal of the species, with the price and value of the mount usually only going up with the size of the antlers or the rarity of the animal. In many cases, sport taxidermy glorifies violence, exemplified by safari trips guided by taxidermists, illegal poaching of wild African animals, and the breeding of animals specifically for fenced-in kill and mount experiences. Botch taxidermy gained recognition as a fine art form during the rise of the road taxidermy movement, officially established in 2004 by Serena Brewer, Scott Beavis, and Robert Marbury. While poorly preserved animals have existed for centuries due to lack of knowledge or skill, contemporary artists began recontextualizing such imperfections as deliberate strategy, grotesque, surreal, or humorous distortions that resist the polished realism of museum displays. Rogue taxidermy as a movement defined itself as a genre of pop surrealist art characterized by mixed media sculptures containing conventional taxidermy-related materials that are used in an unconventional manner. Its key elements include hybrid creatures, fantastical forms, feminist critiques of trophy culture, and an insistence on exposing imperfection. By making failure of preservation visible, botch mounts complicate assumptions about animal bodies, artifice, and death. Botch taxidermy stands as a deliberate rejection of realism and scientific accuracy, embracing distortion and irreverence, whether through glued-on googly eyes, mice posed on stripper poles, or squirrels repurposed as beer koozies. Such works revel in error and absurdity, mocking the seriousness of natural history. While there is sometimes some genuine conceptual weight to these pieces, I take real issue with this genre, considering many but not all pieces that fall under this category to be generally disrespectful, insensitive, and at times appalling. To manipulate an animal's body into absurdity, sexualized anthropomorphism, or grotesque humor feels and reads as a second violation, stripping away any possibility of dignity. What others interpret as playful critique, I see as careless exploitation and mockery of life. Regardless of my stance, box taxidermy has found a wide audience. Some collectors actively seek out the most anatomically amiss mounts and fabricated multi-species chimeras, treasuring their eerie qualities as aesthetic triumphs of wrongness. This appetite for distortion demonstrates how easily dead animals can be reframed for human amusement and spectacle, ridicule, fantasy, desecration, and mutilation long after death. Okay, history discussion over. As an artist working with taxidermy, I do the opposite of most of that. I employ taxidermy as an intimate act of mourning, a way of preserving singularity and natural, not fabricated flaws, to reject the Natural History Museum's fiction of neutrality and instead acknowledge our entanglement with the animal in life and in death. Contemporary speculative taxidermy, as fine art, as defined by Giovanni Aloy in his book Speculative Taxidermy, opened another possibility, one that acknowledges death rather than concealing it, and permits the dead animal to retain a form of agency within what anthropologist Gary Marvin calls a cultural afterlife. A cultural afterlife is how a taxidermy specimen can continue to act, to represent, and to participate in cultural narratives long after its biological death. As Aloy explains, the biological death of the animal does not equate to the end of animal agency. A taxidermy specimen is returned a kind of individuality through the mapping of specific events that shaped its material existence. My work enters this space, but insists on an ethic of care. Oops, sorry. My goal is to restore each animal, not to life, but to recognition, and I want the viewer to feel absence and presence at once. One of the most prominent names associated with speculative taxidermy is Damien Hirst. You may recognize his work. In Mother and Child Divided, a dairy cow and her calf are preserved and bisected in formaldehyde tanks. The piece caused massive public outrage, despite the fact that countless cows are slaughtered daily in meat and dairy industries. The discomfort provoked by the piece speaks to the power of taxidermy art to expose contradictions in how we grieve or ignore animal deaths. Another prominent artist, Mark Dion, creates museum-like installations that mimic scientific displays and dioramas, but disrupt their authority. His work underscores the politics of collection and the ways that animals have been presented as objects of knowledge rather than lives with meaning. His piece, Landfill, mimics a natural history museum's diorama, but with a twist. He created a scene of taxidermy seagulls, a stray dog, and a pigeon in an environment heavily littered with discarded human trash, all neatly contained within a shipping container. In this piece, Inert Wolf, by native artist Nicholas Gallinen, a wolf hack's turned taxidermy and half made into a decorative rug, lies limp on the floor, its body reminiscent of paralysis. The work speaks to colonial violence and to the way that museums have historically displayed indigenous cultures and wild animals as if they were both artifacts of the past. Each of these artists, Hirst, Dion, and Gallinen, have open space for a practice like mine. My work enters this space but insists on an ethic of care and sustainable sourcing. My goal is to restore each animal to recognition. Ethics and sourcing. I work within strict sourcing boundaries. A lot of new viewers to my work see the taxidermy and think about some of the stereotypes and history of taxidermy that we just discussed and assume that I killed the animals in my work. I want to make it very clear, I do not kill animals. I do not use animals that have been killed for artwork. I only use the bodies of animals that died naturally, accidentally, or through licensed veterinary decisions. I do not work with animals that have been hunted or trapped at this time. Thanks to the internet, I have several farmers and ranchers across the country that reach out directly to me when they have livestock losses. They then ship the bodies to me through the mail. And I also have local connections, like a shepherd from outside of Indianapolis and a cattle family from Ohio that are within driving distance. And I'm always on the lookout for roadkill victims, like this raccoon. Several studies suggest that 3 to 6% of drivers may intentionally swerve their car to hit an animal, most notably in the roadkill experiment conducted by Mark Rober. Rober used several rubber animals as the experimental group and a very large leaf as his control, and placed them on the side of the road where tires do not usually pass over. He recorded 1,000 drivers' reactions, and 60 of those drivers went out of their way to hit the rubber animals, while none of them aimed to hit the leaf. And variations of this experiment have been repeated several times with consistent results. These reactions can be attributed to a lack of empathy, a desire for control, impulsive or thrill-seeking behavior, mental health issues, or just a dislike of specific species of animals. And while not all roadkill animals have been intentionally hit, regardless, their bodies on the road always draw my eye in sorrow. So when I have time and the conditions are safe for me to do so, I often pull over when I see them, sometimes to collect a fresh body, and sometimes simply to move it off the pavement and acknowledge that it mattered and just preventing it from being crushed and battered further by traffic. I found a coyote in misprint on the side of the road, absolutely torn to pieces and just barely salvageable. Encounters with roadkill are among the most visible reminders of how human infrastructure impacts animal life and death, and have been a very important site of inquiry within my practice. I I mentioned having partnerships with several farm and livestock owners. Usually they send me stillborn bodies, but along with stillborn bodies, I have been gifted other animal remains. Pictured here is a piece that I made cast from a farm cat that a friend found mummified in their barn. Most of this piece is made of resin, but I have included 3 of the actual rib bones in the piece, as well as the whiskers. A litter of kittens was actually using the carcass as a playground when it was discovered, pawing at the ribs and chewing on the whiskers. Here I cast a section of a cow skull that contains the upper molars and premolars and pewter. I pulled the original bone fragment out of the ground behind the cow barn, and a sort of group grave for the few beef cows that died naturally before they could be sent off to the slaughterhouse. This piece came from a cow that was born in 2012 and died 2 years ago very unexpectedly while pregnant. She was just 2 weeks away from her calving date. All right, now that we talked about my sourcing and why I work with the animals I do, I want to get into my practice, which I consider to be sustainable method of taxidermy. My process rejects standardized forms that are readily available from taxidermy supply companies. Instead, I cast each animal's carcass directly. Here are a few pieces from the carcass casting process. This was the body of the fawn. Most of these are single-use molds. I break open the plaster once I have cast material into it, but sometimes I create another more durable mold out of fiberglass to be able to reproduce the carcass again. And casting each animal's actual anatomy allows the internal structure of the body to guide the final sculpture in a way that is honest and ensures the perfect fit. Every incision, stitch, and sculptural decision is made in response to the singular animal before me, and any defects or imperfections in the body are not fixed to suit the platonic ideal of the animal. You'll notice some visible seam lines in my sewing of pelts. Although with a switch to a specific different stitch, they can be easily hidden, I have left several intentionally. They acknowledge that the body has been disassembled and reconstituted to insist upon the labor required to hold the form together and to maintain a body. I have come to understand my taxidermic process almost as a form of medicine, both the wound and the act of tending to it. Giovanni Oler writes, taxidermy and its resurrective approach to animal bodies has always been concerned with undoing death, suturing wounds, and wiping blood. I know this to be very true. There are many moments in my studio that mirror the care that I give myself as a diabetic. Testing and adjusting chemical levels, maintaining conditions, constant monitoring, and procedural care. The test strips on the top right are used to monitor the pH of a liquid pickle solution, which is the stage of the tanning process that the fawn hide on the left is pictured in. The test strips on the bottom right are used to monitor a diabetic's blood sugar levels and make treatment decisions. I find that the test strips for the pH levels of my pickle solution are almost identical in size and shape to the strips used for blood sugar readings. pH testing must be done every few hours on the dot, or I risk the hair slipping out of pelts and thus ruining it. And early on in my diabetic diagnosis, before I got a continuous glucose monitoring device, I had to do the same for myself and prick my finger at least once an hour to get a drop of blood to keep my blood glucose within a certain range of safety. The vigilance is constant, both in caring for myself and in caring for these animal skins. This piece centers on a 1-week-old male fawn who was born and bred on a high-fence trophy farm. He had already been ear-tagged as future hunting property, to be bought and shot with an arrow once his antlers had grown to an impressive and unnaturally large enough size. Although he was bred as livestock, he died for unknown reasons, likely failure to thrive. I chose not to repair the hole from the tag punched into his ear. I wanted his history to remain visible. He floats slightly off the wall, bending towards a vase of fresh baby's breath flowers. The flowers must be replaced as they dry about once a week, and the dirty water must be refilled. The work therefore demands ongoing acts of care and maintenance. It behaves less like an object and more like a ritual, not unlike a mourner visiting a grave of a loved one. So by introducing gestures typically reserved for human mourners, the sculpture destabilizes the hierarchy that determines which bodies deserve tenderness. The most psychologically demanding work I have undertaken so far involved the memorial preservation of a horse named Ivy. Ivy's owner had posted in a taxidermy forum looking for someone to clean her horse's skull after she was scheduled to be euthanized by a veterinarian. She had been suffering for several years from a chronic and incurable neurological condition. She experienced unpleasant side effects and her quality of life had lowered significantly. I was interested in the project as I felt a profound sense of kinship to Ivy and her medical struggles. I introduced myself and provided examples of my previous work, and the owner and I agreed that in exchange for cleaning and whitening her skull and removing the small white diamond on her forehead, I would have creative freedom with the rest of her remains. When I arrived on the day of Ivy's euthanasia, her body was still warm. I remember recognizing how recently life had left her. The proximity between life and matter was unmistakable. I was really aware that the brain inside had been firing only 5 or 6 hours before. I met the owner, we sat and talked for a while, stroking Ivy from forehead to shoulder. Mortality felt so near and bitter that it transported me back to my own near deathbeds. I felt such a powerful kinship to her. Her death was merciful. There's no delicate way to sever a 100-pound head. The act required both reverence and violence, and I had to detach myself emotionally to complete the task. This is a tension that is difficult to invoke within a sculpture. And that experience clarified something fundamental in my practice. Care is not always gentle. Sometimes care asks us to remain present with difficulty rather than turning away. You'll see I've replaced the missing forehead patch of hide with satin and lace, the same fabrics I used while skinning Ivy's head. The finished sculpture rests now, eyes closed, the black form of the meat of her neck preserved. It is a memorial to a body that once carried pain and received mercy. The piece is a site of mourning for the animal and for my own continued confrontations with bodily mortality. This is a stillborn lamb that I have worked with from start to finish, from skinning to bone cleaning. She's actually been depicted in a total of 10 of my different artworks, documenting different parts of the process through sculptures, painting, and printmaking. In this sculpture, I mounted her hide standing up with wide, unsteady legs, suggesting a first attempt to stand after birth, an attempt that she, of course, never got to make. Her mouth is open, making a bleat, when I know from the feel of her broken ribcage and non-inflated lungs that she never even drew a single breath. I want to draw your attention to her shiny metallic hooves. When young hook animals are born, they come out with soft and flexible toe caps that are designed to protect the mother from the sharp little hooves during birth. They then usually dry up and fall off after a matter of hours of walking around, but this lamb was stillborn and never got to walk around and lose them. Her soft toe caps are now preserved forever, allowing us to observe and mourn the loss of life and youth. And one of the other 9 times I have depicted this white stillborn lamb, I became fixated on my grief while working with her skeleton. Her bones were so young and underdeveloped that the majority of them had not yet fused together, so I had to painstakingly glue the 2 to 3 pieces of each individual bone together. They were so brittle that they easily fractured beneath my fingers on several occasions, even though I was handling them with so much care. Once I fused all the pieces for each bone together with glue, I made a mold of every bone and cast it in pewter, transforming extreme biological fragility into unexpected comparable physical strength and weight. And weight here becomes a proxy for the physical weight of the animal's absence. Pewter, the metal that I cast these bones with, melts at a much lower temperature than metals such as iron, bronze, or steel, and as a result is not as strong or durable. These pewter bones can be dented and even bent if mishandled, meaning the piece should be cared for with similar reverence as actual animal remains. The white lamb that I mounted as taxidermy actually came to me together with a sister, a black lamb. Unfortunately, while I was making the death casts of them, the black-furred sister's pelt became too damaged for me to be able to make any further work with it. So this death cast, which is featured in the back of the gallery, and a couple of oil paintings is all that I've been able to do with her at this point. But in about a week, I'm traveling to an artist residency in Washington, where I plan to make several ceramic urns and vessels to serve as the final resting places of her remains and the remains of any other animals that I have worked with that don't make it into a finished piece. My taxidermic practice does not begin or end at preservation. Alongside the physical act of working with animal bodies, I create two-dimensional paintings and print-based works that document, memorialize, and extend experiences of care. These pieces depict the tools and gestures of the process: an animal mid-skinning, thawing after being in the freezer, pelt soaking in tanning solution, scalpels, needles, scissors, and thread. In my compositions, these tools are arranged with precision and tenderness. The young parrotlet featured in this print came from the freezer of a pet store in Indianapolis. It was one of approximately 137 birds, mammals, and reptiles that had died in the store over a 3-month period of time, since a new manager had taken over and started collecting the bodies. She gave them to me, hoping that someone could still love them to death. I paint the act of skinning as a moment of quiet intimacy. When I perform this act, I try to create a peaceful and comforting space, clean the table, lay down soft fabric, and try to be gentle and present. My largest oil painting, Ode to a Young Farm Buck, depicts a still life of this fawn being skinned on a lace-covered table, surrounded by flowers and the clean bones of other deer remains that I've worked with. This painting is about tenderness and intimacy. It asks the viewer to see the beauty in the care and the ritual and in the trust between body and hand. In many of my two-dimensional works, I create and record moments of emotional resonance. In this print, Next Day Air, I depict 2 stillborn lambs curled together in a cardboard shipping box with ice packs. The shepherd had mailed them to me after they had died, and when I opened up the box and looked in, I was really struck by how gently she had arranged their bodies. They had been placed carefully in sleep-like poses, curled together as if resting. They looked so comfortable, and that care stayed with me, and I needed to honor it, so I made the image into a print, preserving the scene not just in memory, but in ink and paper. Almost all of my prints from the last 2 years have involved a printmaking process called lithography. The drawings I create are very time-consuming and intricate, and they serve as another way for me to spend more time with each animal. You'll recognize this drawing of the same stillborn white man from earlier in the process of the hide being sewn onto her carcass cast, because apparently the other 9 times weren't just enough for me. And this is something that I'm noticing I keep doing with certain animals that I feel a stronger pull to. They just keep appearing again and again. This little eastern mole was found by a student and his dog right outside this building. The day I received the body, I went outside and picked some fresh blooms and photographed him. Then I set him aside in my freezer until I'm able to have time to work with this body further. This little stone litho also features the remains of a few small animals that I found around campus on a walk. I often walk around with my eyes glued to the ground. Pictured here are a small rabbit foot and skull, as well as the lower part of the beak of a small bird, surrounded by the foliage that was growing where I discovered them. So my work always returns to these persistent questions. What does it mean to keep living when you're not supposed to? And what does it mean to preserve a body that could not save itself? Taxidermy cannot undo death, but it can interrupt disappearance. It can slow perception enough to confront what remains, and it can ask us to reconsider our distribution of care. My pieces are structures for staying present with mortality, for resisting the cultural impulse to look away. For me, this practice is ultimately about remaining attentive to fragile bodies, to interdependence, and to the responsibility of caring not only for the dead, but for a human-animal world I hope we can learn to hold more gently. This work is not finished, and it never will be. Thank you. I'll now take questions.
Can you talk about the use of lace?
Yeah, absolutely. I have started using lace kind of as a nod towards, or trying to get my work away from the traditional masculinity that is present in what most people consider to be taxidermy, that really masculine kind of overcoming sort of form. And I had discovered that in traditional taxidermy, there's like a lot of hand sewing. You can't use a machine to sew up a taxidermy piece, and that act of just hand sewing kind of transported me back to, okay, so I'm hand sewing this animal. why can't I hand sew a beautiful pillow for an animal to rest on? And so I started bringing that in, and it also just really does make each piece feel more present, more beautiful, more tender, more intimate, I think. So, thank you.
What direction do you imagine taking the work forward?
I imagine it will probably continue on a pretty similar route to what it has been currently for a while. But since working with Ivy the horse, I have actually kind of become more interested in potentially doing pet memorial work as well. Sitting with that tension or like really uncomfortable emotions that can sometimes arise from working with an animal that was cared for in that way. But I don't want to go away from recognizing the animals that no one ever pays attention to or remembers either. So kind of a practice that would have both of these existing simultaneously.
How long did it take for the fawn from start to
fawn?
finish? Yeah.
Probably about 3 months for this one. Well, it's hard to say because this one has multiple components of care. The actual process of making the animal, about 1.5 months. And then I've been maintaining the piece, replacing the flowers since, I want to say about October of last year. So changing out the flowers about once every week. So I do kind of consider that a part of the making process. So since late summer is when I've been working on it. Thank you.
I was interested in this idea of this one mode that you explained where you said you could possibly create multiple versions of a cast of an animal's body, and so I was just wondering conceptually what that would mean for you, since these seem to be all one singular pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I actually first kind of got into working with animal bodies, and I was more interested in what was beneath their skin at the moment, as kind of a way to learn and become familiar with anatomy. And with each animal that I work with, I do obviously create a carcass cast, but sometimes they're so beautiful just on their own, just the musculature, like structure that is beneath the skin. And so I kind of did want to be able to preserve that beauty because it is so raw and vulnerable and not something that anyone really gets to see, along with being able to also create a finished taxidermic sculpture as well. So.
And then would you consider these multiples, or would each cast be changed so that it just is slightly different from other versions of the same cast?
At this time, I've just been doing the same version of whatever pose the animal's in. However, when I was working with the 2 stillborn lambs, I did play around a lot with manipulating like the leg arrangement and like different poses. I have the one that's standing, and I had also played around with a different kind of initial standing up pose. So it is nice to kind of be able to play around with the parts and pieces until I find something that's really interesting to look at. So thank you. Yeah.
So I know you mentioned kind of like an act of care and violence when talking about the horse. I was wondering if during the taxidermy process for any of the other animals, do you view some of those acts as violent as well? Or what are your thoughts on that?
There have been a couple of times in my practice where I have had to remove certain body parts for the casting process, and it can be very hard on me to do those things. I cry a lot. I usually cry when that happens, but it is sometimes necessary. And then, I guess just as an example, the bones that have been preserved in pewter, I originally had to saw off a leg of the frozen carcass when it was there, just because it wasn't quite in a good position to be able to make a proper mold of it. So those bones, once sawed apart, I then find a way to, I will return them to each other. I will try to fix that. You can actually see evidence of the saw marks in a couple of those bones that are in here. So violent acts do sometimes happen, but again, I try to always create like a peaceful situation, try to go into it in a respectful and intentional mindset when I do. So, thank you. Yes.
So on the piece of the fawn on the wall,
did you always intend to have the baby breath a part of it? Like at one point, did you have the idea to use like live flowers, specifically this flower?
I always knew I wanted it to either be baby's breath, because of the implication that it is, a baby breathing in and out. But I also had considered forget-me-not flowers, but I have found those to be a lot harder to source in this area, so that's why they're not in this specific piece, but I will very likely include forget-me-not flowers in future pieces. Thank you. Yes?
I was wondering about the, kind of like traditional taxidermy smells really bad. I was wondering about your chemicals and kind of like if you've been able to tweak that a little bit to match your values.
Well, so I do traditional taxidermic tanning processes just because I find them to be very effective. They've been practiced a lot. But my practice is at such a smaller scale than those more like industrial taxidermist shops that are pumping out hundreds and hundreds of pelts in a year. So I think that the smell in my studio is very minimal, although I guess you'll have to really ask my studio mates. So I think I keep it under control, and then smellier processes, those are always done outside with like adequate ventilation. So. Anything else?
Could you speak about the urns that you're making in Washington and like the final forms or any materials that you think about like integrating into them?
Yeah, absolutely. I only have a month when I'm in Washington. So I think my time is going to be probably limited to about 2 weeks of actual ceramic construction, but I'm planning on bringing small parts of each animal's skeletal remains to Washington with me and pressing those bones into the clay body so that each vase that I make for each animal is going to be specific and individual to that animal. I'm also considering doing some like small sculptural busts of each animal on top of the lid, kind of like Egyptian canopic jars, if you're familiar with those. Thank you. Yes.
So I think that the thing that keeps us reaching forward as artists is often the thing that we feel like we currently don't have in our work, or the thing that we're kind of not getting in our work. And so I'm always curious what you don't like about your work, because like that's like a thing that kind of keeps this whole operation moving forward. Is if you had to sort of sum up something that you're currently dissatisfied with about your practice that you want to kind of approach in the future, what would that be?
First off, I am dissatisfied with how slow I am. I have a million projects in my head that I wish that I could do, and so many animals in my freezer that I have not yet been able to make work with due to time constraints. But more specific to the actual artwork that I made is I really struggled when I first started drawing and painting these skinning scenes. And I think it was because I wasn't giving any sort of context to the viewer. Like I was just painting an animal on a blank background, and I really didn't want it to come across as like gory or gruesome or anything. So I had just tried to literally put a black and white filter over anything that was red or bloody. And if I could go back and tell myself not to do that, I absolutely would. And to give myself context along with the pieces, because I think that when you're looking at something that can potentially be shocking to viewers who aren't used to this kind of imagery, they just need to see what's going on in my environment when I'm making, and kind of the tenderness that I have towards these animals that just wasn't depicted in some of my earlier works. So I don't necessarily, I really am happy with how I'm doing it now, but it's something that in the past I'm like, I don't love that anymore. So thank you. Okay, well, if that's all the questions, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I know many of you have driven from several states away to be here, and I just really, really am so grateful for your attendance and support. So I now am going to do my defense. I believe we will be shutting down the gallery So, you know, take a couple minutes to walk around if you'd like to spend a little bit more time with the work, but then we're gonna view the gallery to ourselves. So, thank you so much.